Go.
I'd like to welcome you all to the Women's Debate for 2010. The topic tonight, it's British parliamentary style. The topic tonight is that we ban all non-essential forms of cosmetic surgery. On the opening government, we have Gemma Buckley and Meredith Pryor. We have Nicole Franklin and Neil Rao. Closing government is Fiona Prowse and Sasha Rice. On the closing opposition is Mel Schultz and Stone. So without further ado, I'd like to call on Meredith Pryor to open tonight's debate.
So one at 1 minute, one at 5 minutes, 2 at 6 minutes.
Ladies and gentlemen, I've got a dirty little secret, and that's that I enjoy watching The Hills and I like Heidi Montag. But there's something specific about her that alarms me, and that's while everyone was incredibly outraged she decided to go out and buy herself a new face, it's that after she's had dramatic facial reconstruction surgery, she's become more successful. She went on a speaking tour of the United States where she went about talking about how great it is that she's had plastic surgery, how she's more confident now, and now she's more successful than ever. We think on side government today that Heidi Montag is a perfect example of an individual whose consent to have surgery was compromised, but moreover, a perfect example of somebody who's had an impact on the way that the rest of society views themselves. I'm going to look at 3 things today. Firstly, when is it acceptable for the government to ever ban something? And then looking at the 2 harms we think stand under that principle. Firstly, individual harms, and then secondly, societal harms. Gemma's going to talk about medicine and doctors and all those other kinds of fantastic second speaker arguments. In terms of what defines essential and non-essential cosmetic surgery, we think that things that are essential for individuals are twofold. Firstly, when it's a medical necessity, so say you're a burn victim who needs reconstructive surgery, or you have some kind of nose problem that gives you sleep apnea and you need to have some kind of surgery for that problem, but also an issue that is restorative. So let's say you had your nose broken while you were playing soccer and you need that fixed by some kind of plastic surgery. If the purpose of the surgery is to restore your physical feature to the state in which it was previously, we're more than happy for that to go ahead. So, when is it acceptable for the government ever to interfere with your liberties and for it to ban something? So while we accept that the government stands for individual decision making in a range of different circumstances, I think the criteria for government intervention is threefold. Firstly, when the individual doesn't have the capacity to consent. Secondly, when the potential harms of that surgery, even if there is meaningful consent, are so harmful, we think that individual and their consent is therefore invalid. And thirdly, that even if that individual was able to consent to that procedure and consent to the harms, that if the outcome of that surgery or the outcome of that choice is so detrimental to others, we think the government has a mandate and reasoning to step in. We think while it's not true that any individual never has the ability to do things like consent to plastic surgery, sure there might be some people who have the ability to do so. We think that this is analogous to things like age of consent laws. Well, maybe there is somebody, I do know a little bit about older men, maybe there is somebody who has the ability to consent to somebody having a sexual relationship with somebody far older than them. The government takes a precautionary stance where it says that even if some people could, the harms of individuals not being able to consent meaningfully and also the difficulty of being able to gauge that consent is so you can take a precautionary stance and not allow it to occur. So we think that, on the whole, consent issues are so difficult, the government needs to take a precautionary stance. Before I outline the harms, Nita.
Madam, when people are unable to get access to cosmetic surgery procedures domestically and they go off to places like Thailand and Malaysia, how exactly are you protecting them when there is a lack of regulation and accountability processes that are necessary?
Well, we think that firstly, people, like the actual number of people who go offshore and have these kinds of surgeries is incredibly limited. We don't allow them to partake them in the country and give them access to things like counselling to remedy what is essentially a psychological disorder, things like body dysmorphia. I think the number of people who are going to take that up and go overseas are probably the same kind of number of people who do that under the status quo, who go overseas because it's cheaper, whatevs. Alright, so I'm going to talk about some harms. Firstly, let's talk about the individual. We think that these harms are twofold. Firstly, in terms of simply a physical harm. The potential harm of having something like cosmetic surgery is incredibly high, and the possibility of, even if the surgery is successful, irrevocable harm, but also when things go awry, particularly when individuals have repeated surgeries. I only point you to examples like Michael Jackson. It seems a little bit ludicrous when you continuously operate on a part of your body, like your nose. There are considerable harms that get much greater than a number of different surgeries you have. But even if physical harms don't happen, we think that a number of different psychological harms do happen, especially when the kinds of psychological problems and the body dysmorphia that you feel isn't solved after you've had these kinds of surgery. We think that the bigger problem isn't simply a physical harm, it's the issue of consent, Mr. Speaker, in terms of the fact that an individual who's willing to undergo an incredibly painful, expensive and risky surgery, we think that points to issues of depression and desperation in that individual, which mean they don't have the ability to meaningfully consent. When your feelings about this part of your body, which is essentially a non-essential form of surgery, when your feelings about this part of your body are so exaggerated and so damaging, we think that points to an inability to consent. We also think that plastic surgery in and of itself is something that's incredibly addictive and leads to repeat surgery. So people's ability to consent later is also compromised. But moreover, we think even if you could consent to that kind of physical harm, when these individuals are raised in a society that leads to body expectations and the kinds of pressures that are placed in particular on young women, when these individuals don't have the ability to opt out of that kind of media cycle and those issues of kind of social expectations, I think their ability to consent to change their body is compromised. But Mr. Speaker, even if this wasn't an issue, even if an individual had the ability to totally consent, I think the societal harms are enough that the government has a mandate to step in. We think that for individuals, that if it comes to outcomes, the harmful outcomes for society are impossible to avoid, and it's therefore justified that we remove any other kind of freedom, any other kind of liberty. Because the outcomes and the harms exist simply because the surgery is allowed, that individuals are therefore able to take up this option and this expectation that they will. So it goes about reinforcing prevailing social norms, and it says that you should go about doing your best to contort yourself to those and conforming to those because you have the ability to do so, because it means that there's no other norm that can exist when there's this expectation that you should change your physical features, but it also means there's no kind of dialogue about these different types of body image and different types of things that could be just as beautiful and just as acceptable. When there's this prevailing social norm and you have the ability to change yourself to meet that norm, it means that norm never changes, but moreover, there's no kind of dialogue that exists about alternatives for individuals. Mr. Speaker, individuals can't consent to this kind of practice, but even if they could, the social harms are such that we shouldn't stand for it. We proudly beg to oppose.
Mr. Speaker, we found Meredith's characterisation of the stakeholders in this group particularly telling, many that where everyone hates. Because if people are so depressed, if people feel so pressured by this, then surely the outcome is that they will find any way possible to get this surgery. We think the obvious consequence of her own characterisation is that people will try and raise the funds to go overseas, that people will desire this so much that they will do whatever they can to go to other countries to get the surgery. We think the harms, if you want to talk about physical harms in that situation, far outweigh having safe domestic practices. I'm going to be talking in rebuttal quickly, firstly about harms to the individual that were presented, and then on a wider level to society. And then I'll be talking about the ability to consent, the offshore harms that exist, and how you actually isolate and further harm the people that we're talking about in this group. And Nita will be talking about how this undermines choice. So firstly, in terms of the individual, we heard in Meredith's introduction that Heidi Munter got surgery and she made changes to her life and succeeded more, and that's a bad thing. We don't think that's a bad thing. We think all the time in society people should be able to do things that enhance their life. There are two clear different stakeholders in this area today, those that might have some sort of body image issues and those that do not and are doing this because they want to, and we don't think that we should be undermining their choices to improve their life. She also told us that people cannot consent to these things. We think that in both these situations people are able to consent despite the harms. We think that we see this in many levels of society where people consent to things that are harmful. We think we should always proceed on the basis that people are rational in fundamentally all the decisions they make, and we don't think that the harms in this situation are enough to outweigh that. She also told us that people won't go offshore. I told you in my introduction why. If her characterisation of people being so needy of these things is true, then we absolutely think they will. She also told us on an individual level that it won't change people's body image because they're so badly sunk into depression. We think that it's better that these people have a choice, and if they think that what's going to make them happy is having bigger boobs, then we think we should be able to facilitate that, and it's better than removing that choice from them and isolating them further from society. Secondly, in terms of society, she gave us all these examples about Heidi Montage and Michael Jackson. We think those two key examples show why the response to plastic surgery is not always the same thing. Michael Jackson was humiliated because of the surgery that he went under. All these damages and the potential harms were highlighted by using him as an example. In Heidi Montag's case, she had a full-page spread in New Weekly highlighting all the flaws of her plastic surgery. So I don't think that people always respond in a positive way and want to get this. We think, furthermore, there are natural disincentives to getting plastic surgery. We lastly heard that there's going to be no dialogue about what positive body image is. We think that people get different types of surgery all the time. People are now going out and getting butt enhancements after J-Lo. I've seen Paris Hilton, they're getting breast reductions. Your characterisation of what people want and body image, we think is perfectly valid under the status quo, because people differ according to their cultural values and their perceptions as to what they want. They should be able to fulfil that.
For
Yes,
information, you can't divorce these two concepts, Nicole. There are lots of people that suffer from body dysmorphia and depression because they see other people who have unrealistic body expectations that you are perpetuating.
Totally agree, and we're perfectly happy for them to be able to make those choices and enable them to feel better about themselves. We don't think that in every case, every person is going to feel better about themselves, but we think on the whole, most people in these situations should be able to go under this surgery. We also would like to differentiate Meredith's example of underage people having sex. That's a pretty clear example of where the majority of people in that situation haven't reached a level of maturity that facilitates their ability to consent. This is not the same in this situation. Most people are able to consent. It's the far extremes that they want to talk about. So firstly, in terms of consent, as I told you, there are two clear groups in this debate. Those that have insecurity issues, and we think, firstly, that in many situations when people are suffering from severe mental illness, they're covered for under the status quo as it is, and they wouldn't be able to undergo this procedure without a guardian or other kinds of things. We think other people absolutely are able to consent in these situations, and we should not regulate and intervene in this situation. We look at when we do intervene. We think when there are extreme harms and when it's undeniably harmful. So, killing people and doing that kind of thing is bad. But under the status quo, we allow harmful things all the time, such as cigarettes, such as the use of solariums and other cosmetic things that could potentially harm you, could potentially lead to body image problems in the future. We allow people to do that because we fundamentally respect individuals' choices and we want them to be able to maximise their life. We regulate the things they do, and that's fair enough. We don't outlaw them just because we're a little bit unhappy with the possible harms. I don't know what I'm saying. Okay, offshore harm. So if we accept their analysis, their characterisation of these groups, we think that what's going to happen in this debate is that people are going to go overseas and they are going to seek out other ways to do it. Because if they're that depressed, the people are talking about in this situation often have the money to do this anyway, and if they don't, they'll find it. We think the harms in these situations are far greater because they will be going to botchy surgeries. They'll be getting gauze strips left in their wounds and things like that. Their boob jobs are going to explode on them. I don't really know what's going to happen, but the reality is that really bad things are going to happen because we don't have the regulation in Malaysia and Thailand in the backstreet shop in Bangkok. We think it's much better if these people are going to go through with this, that they stay in Australia and go through the proper safety mechanism and the regulations that we have here. And furthermore, as we said, we don't think that this is going to happen in every situation anyway. Lastly, we think that what this is going to do is there's people that are actually trying to help in the debate today, that the insecure people with body dysmorphia and those kinds of things are actually going to feel much more isolated from society. These individuals are already feeling vulnerable, and now they're going to feel like they're being targeted by the government and being told that you are now not allowed to do the one thing that you see as your way out of this. They've exhausted all other options. It's not enough for them to just wear makeup anymore. It's not enough for them to just dye their hair to make them feel better. They need to find a way to make themselves happy, and they feel that the only thing they can do is pay an exorbitant amount of money to improve their body. They don't feel like they have any other choice. So we think by removing this choice from them, they're just going to go to other extremes. So people that want to lose weight and haven't been able to in the past aren't going to go through liposuction because that's not an option. They're now going to resort to anorexia and other potentially far more damaging things to their body and their lifestyle. They can become even more reclusive in society. So we think fundamentally that the harms of removing this, not only are people going to go offshore, but they're going to be feel much more isolated in society and worse than any potential depression or anxiety and things that they might possess already. So for these reasons, we are proud to oppose.
Mr. Speaker, let's talk about what was telling in this debate, because what was telling in fact was that Nicole wanted to get up and acknowledge that the people who are going through these surgeries are mentally ill. She agreed with that, and then the only response she could give us was that the harms are potentially worse if these mentally ill people who principally cannot consent go and not consent to having that surgery in Thailand. Because what we'd say, sir, is that the harms are broadly similar. The amount of fucked up surgeries that happen in the West is quite large. The ability of Michael Jackson to have so many surgeries that his nose collapsed probably suggests that all the safeguards Nicole wanted to point point to don't really exist in her world either, sir. So the only harm they could point to, and the only reason they would let these people who are mentally ill and their own acknowledgement get these surgeries was they'll go offshore. That wasn't good enough. So let's deal first with going offshore, because that was their broad and main harm in this debate. We've got a couple of responses. First, we think you limit access principally. We think there are some people who will no longer be able to go who would have had the surgery before. We think that is a benefit. Secondly, what she told us is that people have to stay and raise the money. We think that's good. The longer people are here trying to earn money, the more access we have to them, the more likelihood that we can change their mind in the short term. We think that's good. But even if we accept that the same number of people are going to get the surgery, they're going to go to Thailand and do it, we think there's a really important benefit from that, sir, which is that the Western governments that we're talking about take a stand. They say that plastic surgery that is not essential is bad and that you can't consent to it. We think that changes some people's mind in the short term. We think, secondly, it changes stereotypes and expectations in the long term, sir. We're happy to wear that short-term harm of those individual people, which we think is broadly similar to what happens now anyway, in order to change those stereotypes. We told you this is the only way we're going to do it. But let's deal with the second harm they pointed to, which is now, instead of getting a nose job, they'll become an anorexic, because that's really logical. If you've got a body dysmorphia about your nose, you're going to become anorexic to fix that. But that's exactly wrong. Well, that's actually not what people are going to do. We think ultimately what people might do, if they can't just principally change that thing about themselves that they don't like, is they might seek counselling. They might actually go to a different avenue of fixing that problem. We think that's ultimately a better thing for them to do. But then let's deal with this issue of consent. Our first response is, oh, Nicole, it was problematic when you agreed that these people had a mental problem and they couldn't consent. That probably undermines all of your analysis about choice and consent for those individual people. But secondly, we told you that even if these individual people could consent, and this was the bit Nicole didn't want to engage with at all, the rest of society cannot consent to the harms of plastic surgery being enabled. The 14-year-old girl, sir, that sits at home and has to watch Heidi Montag run across the United States, being on every radio show and every television show, cannot consent to being forced to believe that that is the way she should look in the future, sir. No one who lives in that society can consent to that. So we fundamentally think that it's the government's role to protect those individuals who don't have the ability to opt out of a social structure that tells them that that's what they should look like. She could never respond to that analysis, sir. But finally, let's do with this vague argument about choice and how we should enable choice for people to feel better about themselves by getting a nose job. We told you that if you can't consent to it because you have body dysmorphic disorder or because you're like a manic depressive, then probably it's not a choice for you in the first place, sir. So we're not really removing anything at all. But as we told you, we think the most fundamental choice here of people is completely disengaged, and that's the entire society to opt into the system which they force. In conclusion to rebuttal, sir, we think fundamentally the harms are very similar regardless of where you get the surgery, but the benefit of a government taking a stand and outlawing it and potentially stopping some people from doing it is important. But secondly, that nobody can actually opt into this choice. So what do I want to bring to this debate? Because I'm going to talk about how the option of plastic surgery affects the medical industry at large before I do Madeline.
Gemma, let's accept for a moment that some people are genuinely mentally ill and are making this choice for that reason. That's a reason to vitiate their consent. What about everyone else who's making an informed, safe decision?
Great. So first, the analysis we brought you was that nobody is making an informed decision about this. And the reason for that, no, let's listen to me. The reason for that is if you're willing, sir, to go through expensive, painful, and very risky surgery to change something about yourself which is non-essential and not that bad in the first place, then your mental calculus is deficient. And we're happy to suggest that that's true of everybody who gets plastic surgery. But secondly, we told you there's a group of people who can't consent even with their logic, which is the rest of society. Deal with that, Madeline. Alright, let's deal with what I want to bring in this debate, which is how this affects the medical industry as a whole. Because what we'd say is that there are a huge and vast number of doctors who leave the medical industry and leave jobs that could be potentially life-saving to go into the plastic surgery industry. I think that's for two reasons. First, it's because there's like a lot of glory associated with being a plastic surgeon. People generally think it's quite glorified, thanks to like Nick Tuck and other shows like this. People think it's like a hard and fast lifestyle, they're going to be with a bunch of pretty people in models, right? That's one reason. We think the more fundamental reason is money. Because your ability to profit out of being a plastic surgeon is much greater than your ability to profit out of most other jobs in that same field. What we think that does to the medical industry as a whole is incredibly damaging. It takes the best and the brightest surgeons and it funnels them into plastic surgery. More specifically, it funnels them into a non-essential medical field. We think that's incredibly problematic. We think we need, particularly in a context in which doctors are very scarce and highly qualified qualified and skilled doctors are incredibly scarce. We need to funnel those people into essential medical jobs where we can actually benefit from their skills more so than people getting those jobs. We think the only way you do that, because you can't change the associated like hard and fast lifestyle ideas, you can't change the fact that it will always be a more profitable industry. What you can change is that the industry exists, full stop. That's the only way you can target these people. I think what you do when you ban non-essential cosmetic surgery is you funnel all of those people back into the medical industry as a whole. You funnel those people into being brain surgeons, into being heart surgeons, because that's better for society at large, and it's better for everybody under the system, because everybody needs to access those services. Nobody needs to access non-essential services. At the end of this debate, sir, they've shot themselves in the foot. They agree nobody can consent, and yet all they can point to is harms that are vaguely the same as the harms that exist in the status quo. We're happy to propose.
Mr. Speaker, as I was sitting at the bench, when Fiona asked Nicole a point of information, which was that women are suffering from body dysmorphia, women are suffering from depression because of people who've undergone cosmetic surgery existing within society, I decided to make a list. I decided to make a list of all the other things in society which are far more ubiquitous and far more prevalent than the existence of people who've undergone cosmetic surgeries. And I made the following list. Firstly, I want to talk about makeup, solariums, skin whitening cream, Naomi Orr, and I'll probably add Sashi to the list in terms of people who purport unrealistic expectations. Guys, is that there are a whole host of things which exist within society which necessarily encourage use, which necessarily encourage people to believe that there is something about themselves that can be fixed. The problem with that side of the house is that they've decided to take all their grievances against makeup, against solariums, against all these other things which exist in society and place them solely on people who undergo cosmetic surgery. We think that's fundamentally problematic. We think it's problematic because if we continue down this line of logic, we're necessarily going to end up banning things like magazines, banning TV shows which feature pretty people, banning things like movies which feature attractive people, Mr. Speaker. You're banning a whole host of things which exist within society which necessarily include the existence of attractive people, Mr. Speaker. That's the problem with their analysis, because they seem to equate cosmetic surgery with attractive, and therefore the only people who exist in society are people who've undergone cosmetic surgery, and therefore we have to ban those people in order to ensure that you get your point across. The problem, guys, is that that doesn't do anything, because you have a whole host of things that exist within society which are much worse in this regard. 3 key questions by way of refutation. Firstly, I want to deal very quickly with the most spurious argument I've heard in debating in a very long time, which came from Gemma, which is effectively all these doctors are moving into cosmetic surgery. Guys, it's basic supply and demand curves, right? If by Gemma's logic, all these people are moving into cosmetic surgery, that necessarily means that there's an increase or an over-increase in supply, guys. What's the problem with that? It means that the person who's left over in hospitals, like in rural areas or in hospitals where they're actually doing good work, are the people who necessarily get the huge salaries. So it's completely spurious to assume that everybody's going to cosmetic surgery in order to get huge salaries, when there is necessarily an oversupply of those people if Gemma's logic was ever to exist. So there are natural incentives to go back to the sector which deals with people and helps people. But secondly, this is problematic in another way, because a lot of the money and a lot of the revenue that comes from cosmetic surgery goes back into research, that it goes into other non-elective types of surgery, Mr. Speaker. This is where a lot of the funding comes from, because cosmetic surgeons can afford to pay exorbitant rates for their surgeries and know that this is all elective surgery, so thus they actually get their bang for their buck in this regard. So we think that this actually takes out a huge revenue generator for those groups of people. But more importantly, I want to move to the second issue, which was effectively, people are just necessarily, this argument about, that's been going back and forth about whether or not people are going to go offshore. Gemma just blatantly asserted the amount of surgeries that are bad in the Western world is somehow equivalent to the amount of surgeries that are bad in the third world. I'm sorry, guys. I'm going to put it out there and say that I think that going to like Zanzibar and getting my nose fixed is probably going to be a whole lot worse and have much more lax regulatory standards than going to a country like America or Australia to get that same type of procedure. This is because they don't have the governmental structure and they don't have the accountability processes that you have in the first world in the first instance. So that was just a lie on Gemma's part, and I'm willing to rest on a balance of probabilities in that respect. But then she said, well, no, this is a good idea, because if we make them stay on shore, this means we can get to them early and counsel them. I'm not sure if Gemma's going to go around like knocking on every person's door saying, are you considering, do you have problems with your body, are you considering getting non-elective surgery, right? You don't have the capacity to change their decision-making calculus. And I'll tell you why, because regardless of what the government tells them in this debate, Mr. Speaker, regardless of whether or not the government says there is absolutely nothing wrong with you, you have a right to be, you are absolutely fine, that doesn't change the psyche of the person in that very position, Mr. Speaker. That person still thinks that their nose is something that needs to be fixed. That person still thinks that their boobs need to be enhanced in order to be able to be happy and exist within society.
society. We think that's entirely legitimate because everybody has their grievances, Mrs. Speaker. And on this side of the House, we're more than happy to allow people access to live whatever it is that ensures them leading their fullest existence, Mr. Speaker. Because we respect that self-actualisation comes in a number of forms, right? If you feel like your way of living the good life is to go bungee jumping and participate in a very risky behaviour in that way, we say that's okay. We minimise risks, we impose safety standards, but we say that that's okay. But by the same token, you believe that your ability to live the good life is solely determined by your ability to change your nose. We think we should allow people to do that as well. Okay, moving on. Actually, I'll take you there, Jane.
Yeah, some governments have banned models who are under BMI from being in magazines. Does that fundamentally take away their choice to be anorexic? Is that a problem, or are you happy to do
Here's
that
the thing,
as well?
right? Firstly, we think that's problematic in the first instance, right? Because we don't think that every single model who was under, who's a size 0 is necessarily anorexic, right? Like, I'm a size 0 for Christ's sake. So it's fundamentally problematic in that instance. But secondly, we absolutely think that's bad because we think that and we think it's led to huge problems in those types of places in terms of those models that you're supposedly trying to protect, feeling far more insular, feeling far more targeted by society, and feeling as if the government is out to get them, feeling as if their very being and their existence is completely incongruous with ideas of basic health and basic happiness in society. So that's problematic in that instance. Okay, I want to bring what I want to add substantially in this debate, which largely deals with the psyche of the people involved in this debate. Because the characterisation or the mischaracterisation we got from Gemma is that we were asserting that all these people are necessarily mentally ill. No, we were never asserting that. What we said was that there is a variety of reasons why people seek out cosmetic surgery, right? We admit that some people are extremely insecure and probably on the verge of depression, but a lot of people just feel as if they need to feel better about themselves, and in order to do so, they need to seek out this type of procedure. It is fundamentally problematic to certainly ascribe a mentally ill attachment, a label attached to anybody that seeks out to go through an expensive or painful process. Because there are a lot of painful and expensive processes which exist within society, guys, and that's the problem with their analysis, because it tarnishes everyone with the same brush. It says that every single person is a mental patient. That's bad for enabling choice in terms of feminism, and that's bad for enabling these people to actually be happy within society. Propose.
Ladies and gentlemen, at the start of this debate, Meredith got up and presented what she probably thought was a really neat model. She got up and she said, we're going to ban everything that doesn't have a medical reason or that isn't restorative. I'm going to start off by giving you a list of things that don't have medical reasons, aren't restorative, but are drastically important. So when you're dealing with, for instance, gender reassignment surgery, there is no physical, medical reason to have it. It's not restorative, but it is vitally important for the individuals who need it. And it's not just things like gender. Someone born with a hair lip has no medical reason to have that fixed. It doesn't impede their ability to physically live a healthy life. It's not restorative, they were born with it. But it is necessary for them to be comfortable in their life, or at least for many individuals who have it, that is the choice that they make, that is an informed choice that they make, and that is something that the government is taking away from them. It's not just those things that are so obvious, and we're not going to rest just on those things. We're also going to deal with issues of body dysmorphia, where it is abundantly true that there is no level of counselling, there is no level of psychological help where these individuals have gone through that help, and that is taken away from them. We think that is true in a surprisingly large number of cases, and we're going to deal with those cases where it isn't true as well. I want to deal with a couple of points of rebuttal before moving into my extension. So I firstly want to deal with the harms to the individuals. I'm going to deal with this very quickly, so I think it's quite a simple point. I'm secondly going to deal with the harms to society. So firstly, in terms of harms to self. They got up and said the nature of consent is in and of itself vitiated, because you're dealing with something that's incredibly painful, you're dealing with something that's incredibly costly, and you're dealing with something that there is incredible pressure on you to do. The same thing is true of restorative surgery for a burn victim. The same thing is true for so many surgeries that they allow under their model, and the reason that they allow it is because they recognise that for a burn victim it is psychologically necessary for them to get that surgery. The same can be true for something that isn't restorative, and recognising that in this debate is something that is incredibly important. Moreover, we recognise that the majority of people who are getting that surgery are informed. When you go in the Western world and sign up to have invasive physical surgery, you sign documentation, you go through counselling, you go through waiting periods, you go through second opinions, you seek medical attention, and you ensure that you're safe doing it. In fact, that's the biggest harm in terms of those individuals. It's when they no longer have access to that information, because not only are they going to Thailand to get that surgery, they're not first going to their doctor and saying, I'm going to go get breast surgery. Is there anything I should know for me medically before I do that? Because it would be illegal doctor to give them that information. That means they're going into that situation uninformed and blind. We think that's far worse in terms of harm to the individual. Let's turn to harms to society, because they said firstly, it stops change in societal norms it creates, and that's harmful. Well, firstly, we point to the pattern in terms of breast surgery. 5 years ago, breast enhancement surgery was what it was all about. Now, it's mostly actually about breast reduction surgery. When you talk about breast surgery, that is the growing, influential surgery. That is doubling every year, and that is incredibly major. We think that shows that it can still change within that, as people recognise that the surgery they got to put those bags of silicone in their breasts 5 years ago was possibly a stupid life choice, and we think that's legitimate, yes.
It's irrelevant whether it's big boobs or small boobs, because at the end of the day, it's perpetuating a body image that is homogenous and disproportionately affects women.
So is Photoshop and Barbie. We don't ban them. And there's a reason we don't ban them. It's because we recognise that women are inherently able to make their own choices at the end of the day. So it's why even someone like John Rugby, who's proposing one of the most radical plans in terms of regulation of body image in the world, isn't proposing banning Photoshop. He's simply proposing having a tagline at the bottom of each photo saying, this image was modified. Thankfully, when it comes to plastic surgery of such an extent that it would have the kind of negative influence you're talking about, they come with their own disclaimer, hiding on tag, Michael Jackson. When you're talking about that level of plastic surgery, that level of extreme change to your body that you want to point to as your harm, it comes with its own disclaimer, and that is in and of itself good. So when it comes to women, the worst thing a government can do for women is say that they are unable to make their own choices about what is important for themselves. And the worst thing the government can do for them is to say the reason for that is that they are so overly influenced by everything going on in society that they are not able to make that decision. That hurts women more than anything else. That hurts women because those do have flow-on effects when it comes to women making choices about what they can do with their lives. So what should the government do when it comes to dealing with women and body image? It should do a lot of what we're starting to do at the moment, a lot of what we've been doing for years. So the first thing is that when you go and get surgery, they actually have a waiting period and a cooling off period and have availability of counselling and a whole range of other things so that you can get that help if you need it. But the second thing that you do is deal with a lot of those push factors that do take away a woman's ability to choose. Barbie is far worse in that sense because they influence younger girls than someone like Heidi Montage. So that's something that we deal with at a different level and we make a different distinguishing decision on that basis. But moreover, that would also be a reason to ban Heidi Montage and all the plastic surgery that she gets. So banning a nose job is very different from saying this individual promotes a negative body stereotype for young women, particularly when you come to our extension. So I've already told you that their model bans some really good stuff and stuff that no one in this room is going to argue is intuitively wrong. Someone who desperately needs to have gender reassignment surgery should be able to access it. That's intuitively true. But it's not just that. Someone with serious body dysmorphia can have exactly the same problem psychologically as someone with a serious gender dysmorphia. And so when you take away their ability to go and seek that help, and with the aim of protecting them from their psychological problems, you take away their ability to seek the help that they need to recover. Because at the end of the day, psychological treatment isn't going to change someone who physically cannot stand to look at themselves in the mirror because they cannot recognise the person staring back at them, because they don't feel comfortable in society, because they feel oppressed within society. That's why they recognise the need for restorative treatment for burn victims. And we think sometimes it's necessary to extend that further. We think choice is valid and we're proud to stand for it.
It's ironic. Ordinarily, in debates involving just women, everyone clamours over themselves to talk about the rights of women and the effect on women. And yet we've just heard a speaker who might have said the word women in a very simplistic way a couple of times in her speech. Because at not one point in Madeline's speech then did she even give Sacha the respect to engage with the extension that she brought out in her speech about how this proposal fundamentally affects women in a way that it doesn't affect men, or not even close to the same extent. That this perpetuates unrealistic expectations of body image, and that we should dare to live in a world that does want to break down those unrealistic expectations. That we should want to live in a world where women don't have to wear heels and makeup to work, while men always only have to chuck on a tie and a suit. And so we'd love for their whip speaker to actually engage with our point that it is unconscionable for governments to enable the perpetuation of this stereotype, and that it's about time that they stood up and actually did something, rather than just propose a warning on a magazine that this person's been touched up. Let's look at three things at the end of today's debate. Let's firstly look at the effect on the individual or the potential candidate here for plastic surgery. Let's secondly look at the very real harm to society that elective cosmetic surgery has and how that alone should vitiate the legitimacy of the consent of the individual here. And let's very finally look at what she would like to term an extension, which is effectively just her point that this isn't fair for people that want gender reassignment surgery, which we think does fall underneath medical necessity in 99 times out of 100. On to this first point in terms of the individual. Let's firstly look at it through the window of consent. What we heard from the opening opposition is some people can consent, so that's enough for us. Why shouldn't their rights be upheld? Well, aside from the fact that we've had 4 speakers that have given you many reasons why they can't consent often in these situations, we think that there are other overriding reasons which mean that their consent isn't the most important balance in this rights discussion. So let's firstly point to the fact that when I asked Nicole a point of information very early on in this debate about how doesn't this play into people's depression and body dysmorphia and actually create the problem for a lot of these people and affect their ability to consent, didn't she agree with that? She did agree with that. So I think firstly it's incredibly problematic and unconscionable that the government is facilitating the development of a condition like body dysmorphia, or at the very least really shitty self-esteem as a young girl growing up. But then, don't worry, they're being helpful by allowing you the tools at which you can deal with the psychological problem that they were instrumental in creating. We think that's fundamentally unconscionable for a government to do, and no government should ever stand for that, whether they're in the developed or the developing world. Let's secondly look at the bigger harms that vitiate the consent here, because even if we thought that some individuals could consent, and we're prepared to acknowledge that of course there are always cases where some people can consent to this level of harm, just like in all rights balanced debates, there are greater reasons why we shouldn't do it. Because not only apart from the fact that you can't divorce the inherent relationship that access to plastic surgery has in the development of a lot of these disorders, but we secondly think there are greater reasons in terms of the perpetuation of homogenous and consistent and unrealistic body expectations for young women in the majority of situations across the world. But before I move on to that, let's look at this point on the black market, because we heard this blanket assertion, particularly from Nita, that they're just going to leave in droves, they're going to go overseas, there's no one left. We'd firstly say that is completely overstated, that people would make the decision to go overseas. We think that governments are instrumental in affecting an individual's decision-making process and what they choose to do with their lives. We think that what we propose at government is fundamentally changing the desire that people even have in the first place, or the motivation that they feel that they have, or the lack of choice in conforming to this homogenous body stereotype, because we remove the practical ways in which they can do it. We secondly think that this policy disproportionately affects women from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, or people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, and there was no response from the other side of the House on that. We also think that it's important that a clear line in the sand is drawn on cosmetic surgery, which we actually think makes making policing of black market surgery, which takes place in Australia at the moment and other developed countries, much easier, because you send the message that nothing is ever okay. Before I move on to this next thing, I'll take Madeline.
Would you ban makeup?
Yes, we've already said that. You should listen to my member speaker. And this moves me on to this point of makeup and Nita's creative list, and I'll get to your creative list later on, Madeline. Because what we effectively heard from Nita is that we want to ban beautiful people. Presumably she's including herself in that list. We'd firstly say that there are fundamental differences between the list of examples that she gave us, i.e. makeup, and cosmetic surgery. But in an ideal world, and this is exactly what Sasha said in her speech, we would like to have makeup non-existent, except in dramatic plays where they need to wear makeup so that you can see their features off stage. I don't know, that was a bit weird. But in terms of the difference, we think the fundamental thing that separates cosmetic surgery from something like makeup is accessibility and the permanence of these things. You wash makeup off after a trashy night like the one I had on Saturday night. It's more accessible for all women, thanks Nicole, it's more accessible for all women to get access to makeup because it's not financially prohibitive, because it's not as arduous. But we would happily accede that we want to ban those types of things that do perpetuate one concept of beauty. Whether it's big boobs or apparently small boobs are in according to Madeline, it doesn't matter, because the point is that you're perpetuating one clear idea. This isn't something like people being able to enhance themselves, because we think that values the wrong things in society. It values a random aesthetic benefit that often people are born with, and that people with a hair lip shouldn't feel like they need to change that hair lip in order to be fully functioning members of society. And that's what Madeline brought us in her extension. Firstly, gender reassignment, which we think clearly satisfies the issue of medical conditions, and I'm glad my openings agree with that. But more to the point, her argument that this means that some people will never be fixed because of psychological and psychiatric treatment. We think that's a massive slap in the face and a massive generalisation and goes against everything that we have learned about body dysmorphia in the past 2 decades. We are proud to propose.
Mr. Speaker, Katie's response to Fallon's question about banning makeup was yes, absolutely. Under that logic, we have to assume things like high heels, push-up bras, all those things have to be banned. Mr. Speaker, I'm perfectly happy to say that I wear huge high heels and I'm more than willing to wear a push-up bra. Why? That often comes down to the fact about how a woman feels within society, so whether she feels comfortable in society and adds those kinds of things onto herself to actually have a good night out, to have the ability to feel confident when she goes out, for whatever reasoning. We think that if women need to change themselves externally, or other members of society need to change themselves externally, so they feel comfortable within society, and they can self-actualise for all those reasons that Madeline pointed out, we're perfectly happy to stand by those people's decisions to actively change those things about themselves, whatever their reasons may or may not be. So firstly, we're going to look at three things by way of rebuttal. Firstly, the model, secondly, on women, and then lastly, just individuals in general. So in terms of the model, we were told that there is apparently a medical reason as to why gender reassignment surgery is allowed, not just blatant assertion, we're never giving any analysis on that. No, there isn't ever a medical reason, most times, 99 times out of 100, there isn't a medical reason for the way that Meredith set this up. She set it up as though things that have direct health implications or were restorative. You guys were never willing to stand by the fact that you can actively treat something that's a psychological issue through physical surgery. You guys weren't willing to address it in that sense. You guys only want to fix physical problems with physical surgery. And we think on that point, and all the things we want to point to, like body dysmorphia and gender reassignment surgery, which are extremely important for people to be able to actively live the good life, as we all like to term it. And we think that's extremely important, and all of you sit down. Now, on women. So, we were told apparently we didn't give Sasha the respect she deserves, so I'm going to spend a few minutes on it now, so Sasha, you're going to be well respected. On the idea about the government pushing towards a homogenous gender. Apparently the government is trying to say, you women out there, all of you, need to look the same. We don't think at all that is what the government is doing. At the moment we have an industry that exists and members of society are allowed to access it. They're allowed to access it if they feel that that is something that they need to do. If they feel like the current shape of their nose doesn't suit their face, they're perfectly able and willing to access that. We think that the government allowing to facilitate that choice is perfectly acceptable. We don't see marketing towards people having bigger boobs or doing whatever, any kind of surgery. The government doesn't market towards this. If anything, it's the exact opposite. So onto the idea about the balance of harms.
One information.
Actually, fair, take it now.
Don't you think it's more damaging when people see an unrealistic expectation and then governments give them the practical ability to actually achieve that unrealistic expectation?
I think that happens all the time when people have unrealistic expectations. Some people think they're going to get a 99.95 and get into uni, and that doesn't happen for the vast majority of people. We think there's a huge amount of unrealistic expectations that exist within society that the government facilitates. We don't ban any of those, so we don't think that this is any different, because that can be just as harmful if you don't get that 99.95 or something. So on back on to the balance of harms. We think that for some people, that overall banning these ideas, you guys are wanting to say that basically what we get in the moment is bad body image, that people have poor body image, poor self-esteem, and that is balanced up against the fact when you remove this function and this ability to actually be able to treat it, what we think we get is these people who no longer have the ability to access these kinds of things. That's when you get things like depression, that's when you get things like self-harm, people who are unwilling to leave the house because they have such a complex about whatever their issue is, they're not willing to actively interact with the rest of society. That's fundamentally harmful for that particular individual and for the rest of society when they can't actively function properly. There's things like these ideas like body dysmorphia, which has been a particular issue thrown back and forth. We think that there is fairly good evidence that shows these developing at an extremely young age, oftentimes as young as 6 months old. We think these are things that can never be corrected. We think the harms of an issue like this far outweighs any of the issues that you guys want to point to on the other side of the house. Dealing with these ideas about the kinds of push factors. We're seeing, about the idea of these, fad diets being marketed, those kinds of things. We think those things are far more harmful than anything you guys want to point to on the other side of the house. We think the ideas like marketing of anorexia models or anything like that, that is where we think the government has been extremely good in not pushing people towards a particular idea or pushing people to all the same, be homogenous. If anything, the government has put a ban, as we've seen, on having these kinds of anorexia models, so that way you don't get pushed into a particular idea. And they're promoted quite heavily. These ideas about body image and the things about what they expect from women is whatever women expect from themselves, rather than what they're telling them or anything like that you guys have tried to say on the outside of the house. So thank you. Onto ideas about these lastly, individual harms. So 2 things about can you ever actually consent and can you actually push people in towards a different avenue. On the idea about when can you actually consent, we were told earlier on in the debate that you can never consent to go through something that's painful and that expensive. Just by the fact that it is painful and expensive, therefore you can't consent to it. We think when it's essential to your self-actualisation, these people are able to make any decision they damn well please. Just because it's expensive doesn't make your ability to consent any less valid. We don't think the price of something makes it less valid in any other circumstance. And we think that a lot of the times these people can consent because the amount of information you're given by your doctors and by just generally that exists out in the world. You have that huge level of information, huge amount of knowledge, greatly increase your ability to have informed consent, which we've strongly stood behind on the other side, on our side of the house. Lastly, onto this idea about pushing towards a different avenue, something such as counselling. We think that counselling has probably already been tried for most of the people we want to talk about. Things like gender reassignment surgery or body dysmorphia. These people go through years worth of counselling. They see hundreds of doctors. They do everything they possibly can to try and deal with their issues. Some people, whatever the psychological harms are that exist for them, they'll never be able to deal with them in a psychological sense or a mental health sense. That ability and that avenue just doesn't exist for those people. We think that's damaging when they can't deal with it. We think it's important that they're able to fix these issues in a physical sense. Just because it's a mental issue doesn't mean you can fix it mentally. For all those reasons, Mr. Speaker, we're very
Ladies and gentlemen, at closing government, we think it's very ironic in this debate that the issue of women themselves has not largely been discussed by any of the teams, and we think unlike the BP Women's Night at Australs, it's a very key argument that needs to be brought out. We think there's no need to be tiptoeing around the point. The overwhelming majority of people who do undertake non-essential cosmetic surgery are women, and today at closing government we're going to show you how this disproportionately affects women and how when the government enables this, it entrenches unrealistic ideals. Before I bring our extension out, I'm going to look at 3 things that have come out at opening opposition. So the 3 things we've heard from them is when can we ban things and this doesn't fall under it. 2, how we should address women who have mental health issues. And 3, the idea of this black market. The first time we heard of when we should ban things, we had a really nice list from Nita of things that we don't ban even though it does allow people to change their image. Ladies and gentlemen, on this side of the house we're happy to say that in a perfect world those things would be able to use because they do actually entrench bad images of women and disproportionately affect them and put emphasis on their appearance that shouldn't be there. But moreover, we think that these things such as makeup aren't actually analogous to things like this because they're more accessible to women and more accessible to women, particularly low socioeconomic standards. But moreover, we think it's a significant difference to cut up your body in the aim of looking better than it is to put a bit of paint on yourself. So secondly, to this idea of how do we actually address women who feel bad about their image. Ladies and gentlemen, we think there's a balance of harms in this debate. We think on this side they've only been willing to look at the harms that's on their side. We heard Nicole concede in a point of information from B that allowing this kind of cosmetic surgery does play into the kind of depression these women have about their self-esteem. Ladies and gentlemen, on this side of the house we're not okay with this. And this side of the house, when we think it should never be a decision to boost your confidence by having this kind of surgery. We think when the government enables this to happen, you're actually allowing that to continue to be a choice and continue to be about part of the calculus. Ladies and gentlemen, we said that even if you concede that you can consent, and we think in the majority of cases you don't, we think the substantial and damaging harms to women as a whole does not warrant this kind of thing. Lastly, to the idea of the black market. And ladies and gentlemen, under the status quo, it's already been acknowledged that there are a number of people that do go to the black market, and people do it because it's just cheaper, and they see that as a positive thing. Ladies and gentlemen, we think on our side of the house, you get rid of the black market more than you do on theirs, because the government's actually sending a consistent message about cosmetic surgery and when you should and shouldn't get it, ladies and gentlemen. But moreover, it physically makes it more and socially able for them to police this, because physically you can tell, but socially you've said it's not okay, so you never allow it to happen in any kind of cases, and I'll take now.
Surely people that are looking at spending $20,000 with an inherently risky procedure have already exhausted all other options to correct whatever minor disorder which is depressive people and covered under the status quo that they might possess.
We don't think that's true. We don't think if you're ever spending $20,000 to change a small part of your body that that's ever a very healthy calculus. We think that to ever spend that amount of money on changing your body body that you should have already undergo a lot of counselling and a lot of mental health things. Moreover, as I'm going to bring you out in your extension, we don't think that's ever a legitimate choice or ever a choice the government should be enabling, because it just further perpetuates and entrenches bad things about women, which allows more women to make that $20,000 choice, which is absolutely horrendous. So today I'm going to be talking about why the government should sanction the promotion of these ideals, and further how this proportionally affects women, and particularly women of low socio-economic status. No, thank you. We think that this is a government-sanctioned promotion of women's body ideals, because as I alluded to earlier, the only people who are getting this kind of surgery are women. We think the government is saying all women should look like this, only women should look like this, and it further perpetuates images, which I think both sides are happy to concede are quite unrealistic and quite damaging. We think the government has a moral responsibility to take a stance on this. We see that when John Brumby wants to stop, enhancement of women in magazines or have things like this. We think it's actually worse when you allow cosmetic surgery, because we think that magazines and filtering women through magazines is bad. We think it's even worse when you actually allow real women within society to have this plastic surgery, because currently a lot of people know that those images in magazines aren't real. When you walk down the street and you see someone that's had plastic surgery, you actually start to think that it is real and that is achievable. And we think that's even more harmful, and it's exactly why the government has a mandate to step in, and why that's actually something that really needs to happen within this debate, ladies and gentlemen. We think that it perpetuates the kind of choices that you want to talk about, because for every one woman that does get the surgery, there's 10 more that feel bad about it and now think that that's something achievable. That leads me, secondly, to how this disproportionately affects women of low socio-economic status. Because let's face it, when we're talking about the $20,000 surgery that Nicole wanted to talk to in our POI, there's only a limited amount of women within society that can actually access. And it further allows elevation of women from higher socio-economic statuses to continue a better appearance and a better stance within society. We think it's really harmful for the 100 women, for every one rich woman that can't get plastic surgery, to realise that they can't get that. We think it further deteriorates perceptions of women within socio-economic status, and actually drives women from low socio-economic status to go to Thailand, or wherever else they want to talk about, and get this really dangerous surgery which they shouldn't be accessing. Because we think that this is damaging to women, we're very proud to oppose.